Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. You can find us online at cruxnow.com. And I'm also the host of this show, Last Week in the Church, which is the show where we kind of raid the journalistic fridge. That is, we kind of take out some stories that are a few days old, we throw them in the skillet, sprinkle over some spices and our secret Crux brand sauce, and serve them up piping hot and delicious. Here's what we've got for you this week. First, a partisan pope? The Latin Rite Bishop of Kiev in Ukraine actually says the pope should not come to Kiev right now because he is seen as excessively pro-Russian. We'll try to figure out what's going on there. Secondly, the cardinal who won't be. One of the cardinals appointed by Pope Francis on May 29th is actually bowed out because of the baggage he carries on the sexual abuse crisis. We'll explain why, whether this was intentional or not, it's actually an important lesson for the cardinals who will elect the next pope, whenever that moment may come. Then third, the puzzling periphery. Although Pope Francis is, in virtually every respect, a pope of the peripheries when it comes to naming new cardinals, there is one periphery in his own backyard which Francis, in tandem with every pope for the last 160 years, has kind of overlooked. We'll try to figure out what's going on there. And then finally, much ado about Verona. Now, this mixes two Shakespeare references, Much Ado About Nothing and, Romeo and Juliet, which was set in Verona. But nevertheless, it's appropriate because we're going to explain why next Sunday's mayoral election in Verona shapes up as a referendum of sorts on the Pope Francis papacy. All that and more is waiting for you on this edition of Last Week in the Church, so please stick around. Well, hello everybody again. Happy Tuesday to you. We begin this week with the partisan pope. Now, this has to do with Pope Francis and the war in Ukraine. Now, what has happened most recently is that the Latin Rite Bishop of Ukraine, a bishop by the name of Vitaly, oh, come on, Elise. My wife, Elise, who is filming this, help me. What is his actual name? Kravitsky. Vitaly Kravitsky has given an interview to Avvenire, which is the official newspaper of the Italian bishops, in which he has basically said that although it would be a great idea if Pope Francis were to come to Kiev, in the way that many other global leaders have done to demonstrate solidarity with the Ukrainians in the current war with Russia, Kravitsky has said that right now it's not such a good idea because the Pope is no longer seen as non-partisan. That is, that many Ukrainians now see him as, well, for lack of a better way of saying it, excessively pro-Russian. Now, basically, this is in the wake of an interview that Pope Francis gave in May, so it's by now more than a month old, but an interview he gave to the editors of Jesuit publications in Europe, in which at some length Pope Francis discussed the war in Ukraine. And he said several things that rankled Ukrainian sensibilities. Okay, so to begin with, he said there are no metaphysical good guys or bad guys in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, of course, for many Ukrainians, there is actually a bad guy in this scenario. His name is Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. And so the fact that the Pope did not acknowledge that was, obviously a little bit hard to swallow for many Ukrainians. Secondly, while the Pope condemned Russian atrocities in Ukraine, he also condemned the arms trade in Ukraine, which some Ukrainians took as a statement of opposition to efforts by Western governments to transfer arms to Ukraine to allow them to defend themselves against the Russian invasion. And then finally, the Pope quoted a conversation he apparently had with an unnamed head of state prior to the February 24th Russian invasion, in which this head of state told Pope Francis that NATO was barking at the doors of Russia and that might actually trigger a conflict. Now, to many Ukrainians, that sounded as if Pope Francis was saying that Russia actually had a legitimate reason to invade Ukraine to defend itself against aggression by NATO. Now, all of that, according to the Latin Rite Bishop of Ukraine, of Kiev, has created a condition in which the Pope is no longer seen as non-partisan, but instead is seen as, to some extent, an apologist for the position of the Kremlin and the position of President Vladimir Putin. Now, we should say that the breaking news as we record this episode of Last Week in the Church is that the foreign minister of Ukraine has refuted all of that and said that the Pope would be very welcome. But nevertheless, it does reflect a kind of ambivalence, I suppose, among some Ukrainian Catholics and some Ukrainians generally about where Pope Francis actually stands. Now, there are two bits of context that probably are important here. One is that whatever you think of the position that Pope Francis has taken on Ukraine, this is not Francis going rogue. This is not, a liberal pope who was bucking the Vatican tradition. On the contrary, this is actually a pope who was acting in accord with what has been the Vatican's long-standing diplomatic policy, which is that you never publicly condemn aggressors in a conflict, that instead you try to keep channels of communication open, and that the idea is that by avoiding public fireworks, you buy yourself the opportunity to try to influence events behind the scenes. I mean, to give you an analog, in 1987, Pope John Paul II visited Chile, which was at that point under the Pinochet dictatorship. Now, John Paul II allowed himself to be photographed in the Moneda Palace in Santiago, the presidential palace, with Pinochet, which at the time was a source of great umbrage among human rights activists and others who felt that it was inappropriate for the Pope to be seen as, in effect, what they saw as legitimizing the Pinochet regime. However, behind the scenes, John Paul was pushing Pinochet to step aside, and in fact, the police state in Chile collapsed shortly after the Pope's visit. Now, we don't know what the effect of Pope Francis's attempt at balance will be in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, but my only point is that what he is doing now is entirely consistent with the Vatican's long-standing approach to these sorts of conflicts, which is to avoid public fireworks in order to be able to operate behind the scenes as a kind of voice of conscience. The other bit of context we probably ought to supply is that Pope Francis's condemnation of the arms trade hardly started with Ukraine. He has been condemning the arms trade since the very moment of his election in March 2013. And while it is natural for people in a particular place to assume that the Pope is talking about them when he makes a kind of generalized statement, the reality of the situation is that Pope Francis has always been an opponent of the global traffic in arms, whether the place in question is Ukraine, or it's the Congo, or it's locations in Latin America, or anywhere else. And so it is not necessarily the case that when the Pope condemns the global traffic in arms, he is taking a position as to whether Western powers ought or ought not to be able to assist in Ukraine in its own legitimate self-defense. We will see how all this plays out, but the bottom line is that for many Ukrainians right now, there is a perception that Pope Francis, quite honestly, is not their most reliable ally. And probably we should add a third piece of context, which is this is not a new sensation for Ukrainians. Like during the period of Soviet occupation of Ukraine, there was a great deal of umbrage about the policy of Ostpolitik, that is, outreach to the Soviet Union, that was practiced under Paul VI and that continued under John Paul II. Ukrainians are kind of accustomed to feeling like the Vatican isn't necessarily their best friend when it comes to confrontations with Russia. And so I guess the point is there is nothing new under the sun. We should also say that Pope Francis has tried in every way he possibly can to demonstrate compassion for the suffering of the Ukrainian people. I mean, he's been photographed and filmed kissing a Ukrainian flag that came from Bucha, the infamous site of Russian atrocities in Ukraine. Nevertheless, Pope Francis is attempting this delicate balance between, on the one hand, signaling compassion for the Ukrainians, on the other hand, trying not to be seen as an inveterate opponent of Russia and Putin. Whether or not that is an appropriate thing for the Pope to be doing, I suppose, is a matter of opinion. But I would again emphasize that whatever you think of it, this policy didn't begin with Francis, and it won't end with him. All right. Second up this week, the Cardinal who won't be. So on May 29th, during his traditional Regina Caeli address on Sunday, Pope Francis announced 21 new cardinals in the Catholic Church, including 16 who will be electors, that is, who are under 80 and eligible to vote for the next pope. One name on the list was Bishop Van Looy of Belgium, who is one of the honorary cardinals, right? So he's over the age of 80. He wouldn't be eligible to participate in the next conclave anyway. Presumably, Pope Francis meant to honor Van Looy for the fact that he was a participant named by the Pope in one of the Pope's synods of bishops, and also that the Pope had named him to be a member of the board of directors of Caritas, the global Catholic charity. And so one presumes that that's why Pope Francis decided to give him the red hat. However, Van Looy also carries a considerable amount of baggage when it comes to the clerical sexual abuse scandals. Now, we should emphasize that Van Looy himself has never been accused of abuse, but he has been accused of mismanagement of several cases where clergy under his jurisdiction have been accused of abuse. And according to critics anyway, he did not respond appropriately. For example, in 2010, testifying before a Belgian parliamentary commission, he admitted that there were 6 cases of priests who have been accused of abuse that he did not report to civil authorities because, as he described it, these priests were already retired and he didn't regard their cases as pressing. There is another case of a priest who was a fellow member of Van Looy's Salesian religious order, who had been accused of sexual abuse, but nevertheless was allowed to go on to the Central African Republic and actually was involved in sponsoring orphanages there, where he had direct access, obviously, to vulnerable young people. And that has been a subject of controversy. In any event, Van Looy recognized that his appointment was going to be perceived as offensive and controversial among survivors of clerical sexual abuse and asked the Pope's permission to withdraw. Now, the larger significance of all of this, I guess there are 2 points. One is that Pope Francis, from the very beginning, that is, from his election in 2013, has very much taken personal control of the appointment of cardinals. He doesn't really consult anyone, and in fact, nobody is advised before the fact of who he's going to appoint, including, by the way, the nominees themselves. Now, in some ways, you can say that's very creditable because the idea is a cardinal, from the very beginning, the idea is that a cardinal's appointment is supposed to be a personal choice of the Pope. Francis is taking that very seriously, right? And doesn't run this through focus groups and, other mechanisms of vetting, but instead makes these decisions himself, which you could argue, in a way, is like a return to the origins of what it means to be a cardinal. But on the other hand, it also means that when there are vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities have not had an adequate opportunity to be vetted. And look, I think the big takeaway here is that the Van Looy episode, which is not that big in and of itself, but the big takeaway is this. It is a reminder to the cardinals, and as of August 27th, when Pope Francis holds his 8th consistory to create new cardinals, there will be 133 cardinals who are eligible to vote in the next papal election. It is a reminder that they better be pretty sure that whoever they elect does not carry this kind of baggage on the sexual abuse crisis. Because while the wider world may not get very excited about an over 80 cardinal who had to decline his red hat because he was carrying some baggage on this scandal, imagine how the world would react if somebody like Van Looy were actually elected Pope, right? And so it is a reminder that you want to be very careful about for whom you cast your vote to be sure that the next papacy will not begin under a cloud. And so in that sense, whether Pope Francis intended it or not, he has actually done a great favor to those cardinals who will have to, whenever this moment comes, who will have to elect a successor, because it's a reminder about the kind of homework that they're going to need to do. All right, third up this week, the puzzling periphery. So, Pope Francis, from the very beginning, in terms of where he creates new cardinals, has been a pope of the peripheries. He likes to reach out to places that have never had cardinals before, that he considers to have been neglected or forgotten in terms of global affairs. So, on August 27th, when he creates a new crop of cardinals, these cardinals will include first ever red hats for East Timor, for Paraguay, for Singapore, and for Mongolia, right? All places that have never really enjoyed a particular moment in the sun, right? In terms of global attention, and they'll be getting it on August 27th, thanks to Pope Francis. Yet, curiously, there is one periphery that Pope Francis really has never reached out to. And as I said at the top, he's not alone. No pope since 1861 has really reached out to this periphery, which is the south of Italy, what Italians call l'Italia meridionale. It basically means the southern part of the country. In 1861, armies from northern Italy invaded the south and basically forcibly annexed it to the new unified Italy. Ever since, there has been a dramatic gulf between northern Italy and southern Italy. Northern Italy has been developed, affluent, successful. Southern Italy has been impoverished, neglected, and abandoned. And if we look at the distribution of cardinals in the Italian Catholic Church, let's start with the fact that in this consistory on August 27th, there are actually 2 new cardinals from the north. There are no new cardinals from the south. Actually, as of August 27th, the entire Italian South, which comprises, in terms of population, about a third of the country, will have roughly the same number of cardinals as one Italian region in the north, which is the Piedmont, which is an especially bitter pill for southern Italians to swallow because it was the armies of the Piedmont that invaded the south and forcibly annexed it to the new Italy. Now, we should be very clear that this policy of neglecting the Italian South did not originate with Pope Francis. It actually originated in the 19th century because the 8 Italian popes from the annexation in 1861, until the election of John Paul II in 1978, all those 8 Italian popes were from northern Italy. And then the 3 popes who followed, so John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, that is, someone from Poland, someone from Germany, and someone from Argentina, had no particular connection to the Italian South. In fact, Pope Francis's own personal ancestry, his family, comes from the Piedmont in the north. And yet, it does still just seem strange that in the Pope's own backyard, let us remember that the Pope is the primate of Italy, right? So he has a responsibility for the entire Italian peninsula, that the South has been so systematically neglected. And it's also worth saying that in the case of Pope Francis, right, Pope who has been so focused on trying to lift up and shine a spotlight on the peripheries of the world, this periphery in his own backyard would be sort of left out of the mix. Now, the one thing that is interesting is that over the course of the next year, 4 of those cardinals from northern Italy are actually going to age out. They will pass the threshold of being 80 when they are no longer eligible to participate in the next papal election, which affords Pope Francis a chance to sort of right the scale, to balance the scales, right? To balance the kind of weight of history. We will see whether this Pope of the peripheries decides to take advantage of that opportunity that is afforded him. All right, finally, this week, much ado about Verona. Now, as I conceded at the beginning of all this, this mixes a couple of Shakespearean metaphors. But here's the deal. Last week on this show, we talked about the surprising success of the kind of left-wing candidate for the mayor of Verona in Italy, a guy by the name of Damiano Tommasi, who was a former professional soccer player for the Roma team. He was on the team the last time Roma won the Italian national championship, which was 22 years ago in the year 2000. And he is also kind of like ultra-Catholic. Like his nickname as a soccer player was Il Chiarichetto, which basically means the altar boy, because he went to mass all the time, and he and his wife have many kids, and he is just seen as like really, really, really Catholic. And he is also a disciple of an Italian priest by the name of Lorenzo Milani, who was sort of known as Italy's peace priest. Tommasi, inspired by the example of Catholic social teaching, he and his wife founded a popular school for poor kids in the environment of Verona, and is just kind of in every possible way considered like really Catholic, okay? However, in his campaign for mayor in Verona, he ran, even though he insisted he didn't want any partisan affiliation, he was backed by all the left-wing forces in Italy, so the Democratic Party in Italy and others. Now, the thing of it is, Verona, which is a city of about 260,000 people, more or less, is traditionally a very conservative place. Like, they have had conservative mayors since 2007. It's considered a stronghold of the Lega party in Italy, which is kind of an anti-immigrant, right-wing populist movement. And so Tommasi's success was always kind of improbable. And in the initial round of voting last week, Tommasi finished first. He got about 40%. But that's only because there were two conservative candidates who kind of split the conservative vote. Together, they had about 60%. So one would think that when the election comes next Sunday, the runoff, that the conservative candidate would win. However, the truth is, those two conservative candidates don't get along very well. And despite efforts by the national parties to force a kind of coalition between the two of them, they both have resisted it and said, look, we don't really like each other, and so we're not on the same page. In this context, the Bishop of Verona, a guy by the name of Giuseppe Zenti, who was first appointed the Bishop of Vittorio Veneto in northern Italy by John Paul II, and then appointed the Bishop of Verona by Benedict XVI, who is a classic kind of conservative bishop. He put out a pastoral letter on Saturday in which he said that no Catholic in conscience could vote for a candidate who supports what he described as gender theory, assisted suicide, or abortion. Now, this was perceived as a clear condemnation of the Italian left, which has a kind of permissive position on all of these issues, and therefore a kind of de facto endorsement of the conservative candidate in the Verona election. In other words, to try to simplify all of this, Sunday's runoff between the center-left candidate, Damiano Tommasi, who is, by all accounts, an incredibly faithful but progressive Italian Catholic, and the center-right candidate, shapes up in some ways as a referendum on the kind of Pope Francis view of the church. I mean, you know, which side are you on? Do you support the kind of progressive, permissive, dialogical vision of Catholicism that is kind of incarnated by Tommasi and supported by the Francis papacy? Or are you more with the kind of conservative vision of the church incarnated by Bishop Zenti and associated with the papacies of John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and the legendary leadership of the Italian bishops under Cardinal Camillo Romini, and the whole idea that there are non-negotiable values that simply cannot be set aside. So, I don't think anybody ever nominated Verona as the venue in which the contest between these two competing visions of the Catholic Church would be adjudicated. But nevertheless, it is fascinating that in Sunday's election, there are two clearly delineated visions of what the Catholic agenda for public life should look like. One, which is the agenda of Pope Francis, the other, the agenda of his predecessors. And 260,000 Catholics, because Verona is an overwhelmingly Catholic city, 260,000 Catholics will have the opportunity to cast their ballots between the two of them. And it will just be very interesting to see how all that turns out. All right, that is our show for this week. Thank you so much for being with us. We will be back here next Tuesday, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, you can find full coverage of all of these stories on the Crux site. Again, that is cruxnow.com, cruxnow.com. your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. Over the course of the next 7 days, my charge to you is stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed week, and we will talk to you again soon.